Good morning and welcome to you all. The Naval Association acknowledges the Turrbal Wajagara people, the traditional owners of the land and hunting grounds on which this ceremony is located. I'd like to invite Helen Yench, State President of the Naval Association of Australia, Queensland Branch.
All those who served as Coastwatchers. On behalf of the State Executive, I would like to welcome Her Excellency, United States of America, Ambassador Caroline Kennedy. Dr. Rosemary Gill and Miss Elizabeth Gill. Rosemary is our guest speaker, and Elizabeth and Rosemary's father was Lieutenant James Connell Howard Gill, a Royal Australian Naval Volunteer Reserve who was a member of the Coastwatchers. Mrs. Betty Lee, Susan Peatfield and Alison Early, great nieces of Commander Eric Felt, RAN, leader of the Coastwatchers. Mr. Ken Chung, he was saved as a child by the Coastwatchers. Thank you very much and welcome to all those people. We hope you enjoy the service. We'll be back with you soon.
I'd like to now invite State Chaplain Reverend Canon Gary Harsh to lead us in prayer.
I offer these prayers in my tradition if you would like to take these words in your own tradition and reflect on them. Help us who live in this ancient land where we were born or have come and now call home, to honour its native soil and water, both here and abroad. Hear our prayer.
Amen.
Thank you, Gary. I would now like to invite Rosemary Gill, the daughter of Lieutenant James Connell Howard Gill, to provide the address. Ladies and gentlemen, Rosemary is a retired history lecturer graduating from the University of Queensland as a BA with double first-class honours in ancient history and history. She was awarded a British Council scholarship which she took up at the University of London, where she completed a PhD in medieval history. Rosemary is a published historian and agrees with the Faulkner quotation, which is, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Gill.
Your Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My father, Connell Gill, enlisted in the RANR in July 1939 when he was 23 and was posted to Port Moresby. There he was made telegraphist and secretary to Lieutenant Commander Hunt. He soon met Commander Eric Felt, the man charged with the extension and maintenance of the Naval Coastwatching Association. In May 1941, Dad was promoted to Paymaster Sub-Lieutenant and Naval Intelligence Officer and began to help Felt with administration work. This really was when he became a Coastwatcher. In December that year, my father was sent to Rabaul to assist Lieutenant Hugh Mackenzie, also a Naval Intelligence Officer, a man of about 40, who'd been called out of retirement to work as Felt's assistant and given the rank of acting lieutenant. Today I can give only the sketchiest outline of my father's story and shall begin with the immediate aftermath of the fall of Rabaul to the Japanese on the 23rd of February 1942. Dad, his immediate superior Hugh Mackenzie, and a group of enlisted men and civilians made up a group of about 20 survivors. A highly dangerous 2-month journey by land and water lay ahead of them. They had 2 imperatives. First, to reach a communications post so they could pass on all available information to Port Moresby, and secondly, to find an evacuation point. The party had to split up at least twice. How did the group that devolved to my father's charge, how far did the group that devolved to my father's charge actually travel? Well, as the crow flies, the crow being me with a big atlas and a long ruler, it's about 480 kilometres. From Calais, south of Rabaul, to Marai, down the south coast of the Gazelle Peninsula to Sanpun, then a long backtrack, necessary unfortunately, to Rhyl on Henry Reid Bay, and an overland haul to Lullabou on the north coast of New Britain. Then a further trek west by land and coastal waters to Aboki, and finally the sea journey to WWII Island, where they began the voyage back to Australia. About 480 kilometres according to that ruler, but soon after Calais they began their long encounter with what Dad described as the vertical type of geography, which we got to know so well. In his service diary, which he kept for the duration of the trek, he recorded distance on a time basis because he explained linear distances have little meaning. To go forward 1 mile, you often have to travel 4 or 5 miles nearly vertically up and down. So the total distance covered could be anywhere from a very conservative 500 kilometres to 1,000 kilometres, or possibly more. Initially, the group had a teleradio with them, but Hugh Mackenzie decided it had to be destroyed if they were to outpace any Japanese pursuit. On the 6th of February, when they were about halfway between Calais and Marai, Mackenzie and 5 of the members of the group left for Waterfall Bay, further to the south, where a teleradio was thought to be. Their journey suffered interminable delays from illness and the presence of the enemy, and a second start had to be made in early March. But by then, hope was starting to seep through. Word had come from the North Coast that an assistant district officer, Keith McCarthy, was tasked by Major General Basil Morris, the GOC, to evacuate all possible personnel from New Britain. Mackenzie, before this second departure, placed my father in charge of the remaining 14 men. Dad's orders were to proceed to McCarthy, who had a teleradio on the North Coast, and send word to the Navy of Mackenzie's intentions. My father and his party were dogged by exhaustion and illness, exacerbated by poor diet. But Dad had a ferocious will to survive, and his credo was to help everyone in his charge survive too. This strength of his would be tried in some terrible ways. But he finally met McCarthy on the 14th of March, only to find him unwilling to use the teleradio because he suspected the enemy had picked up earlier transmissions. My father recorded that he and McCarthy talked far into the night about evacuation plans, and Dad also taught McCarthy Eric Felt's variation on the coast-watching Playfair code, which provided greater security and allowed keywords to be used for longer. A coastal sea journey took them to a small island near Aboki, where Dad was able at last to send a teleradio message to Port Moresby about Mackenzie and their overall situation. There followed the short voyage to WWII Island, where they commandeered the Burnsville vessel Lakatoy and made their voyage back to Cairns. I want to tell you a little more about events surrounding the departure of the Lakatoy, since Dad was so intimately involved with these. The vessel itself was a 350-ton steel-hulled inter-island trader. It had been moored at WWII Island since the fall of Rabaul because the captain refused to budge. Whilst McCarthy investigated the possibility of an air evacuation for the almost 250 personnel now gathered at Aboki, My father talked to Jim Lumley, the second engineer of the Lakatoy, and he was able to report to McCarthy that the vessel had sufficient fuel and water to cover the voyage from Witu to Cairns. He recorded, "I had to talk to McCarthy about trying to get the Lakatoy out, as I knew how useful she'd be on the Australian coast." McCarthy went one better. If aircraft were not available, we could ferry the troops out in the Lakatoy too. This became the plan of evacuation. My father knew the ship's cargo of copra would have to be disposed of. He'd seen one go up like a tinderbox at Port Moresby, so it went overboard and was replaced by sandbags to hold the ship stable and make room for more personnel. He also insisted that the white ship be camouflaged. That was a task taken up by Lincoln Bell, one of McCarthy's men. He said that the result, a startling mix of grey, brown, green and yellow, certainly made the Lakatoy unrecognisable. Most important of all, my father ensured that the Lakatoy avoided the main sea lane to Samurai. And he did that because back on the 11th of February, on the trek, he'd watched and plotted the schedule of Kawanisi flying boats from Rabaul on afternoon patrol over the sea lanes to the south of New Britain. He knew exactly where the Lakatoy should not be. And he provided one final, wonderful flourish in the face of wretchedness and weariness. My father wrote, "Although Lakatoy was not a commissioned ship, as a gesture, I had signalman Brierley and Parker make a white ensign out of a bedsheet, a pilot jack, and some red calico. We flew our ensign all the way from Witu to Cairns." Once back in Australia, there was obvious need for rest and recuperation. The effect of malaria, ulcerated legs, starvation, exhaustion, and stress could not be denied indefinitely. But my father was young, and he'd survived. On the 16th of June in 1942, he and my mother, Betty Blair, were married, with little notice given the vagaries of leave, but they always said they could not imagine a happier wedding than their homemade one. Married life began in Townsville, where Dad continued on the staff of Operation Ferdinand, as the coast-watching organisation would be known for the remainder of the war. But his health broke down again and again. Malaria led to pneumonia, which led to pleurisy, and he was finally discharged in 1944. He and my mother returned to Brisbane, where he completed an LLB at the University of Queensland and went into practice in his father's legal firm. He'd actually completed a BA and the Solicitors Board exams prior to the war. He'd always loved history, and having felt its hand on his own shoulder, devoted what time he could to learning how to write well-researched historical papers and books. He continued to serve in so many different ways, and there simply is not time to list the organisations and institutions he helped, and all in an honorary capacity. My father was awarded an MBE in 1975 and an AM in 1984, and it was always a matter of quiet pride to him that these honoured his voluntary work. His outlook was simple. He'd been spared when so many men his age had not, and he felt the desire to build up and enrich the community and the country that he and they had defended. He was, to put it simply, a hero hidden in plain sight. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary, for that insight into your father's service. And thank you, Rosemary, and your sister Elizabeth, for your father's service. Thank you for the content around John F. Kennedy. I'm now going to ask the President, Helen Yench, to address the rescue of of Lieutenant John F. Kennedy.
Today we have 3 or more women who have something in common. Rosemary and Elizabeth Gill, for his father, had served his country as a Coastwatcher. Betty Lee, Susan Peatfield and Alison Early, 3 relatives of Eric Felt, another Coastwatcher. And last but no means, Your Excellency. His father served his country and was rescued by a Coastwatcher. The following story is that of a Coastwatcher, Lieutenant Arthur Reginald Evans, DSC, Royal Australian Naval Reserve. And it goes like this. I shook hands with the 35th President of the United States on a Pacific island in 1943. He and his men ran raids on Japanese supply convoys. They were shot at, they were fired at, but steered clear of major incidents for 4 months. PT-109, a motor torpedo boat, some 24 metres long and 40 tonne, carried 4 tube launchers and was commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy in the Blackett Strait on a dark moonless night on the 2nd of August 1943. The Japanese destroyer Amagiri ploughed into the boat, cutting it in 2. As the fuel on board exploded, 2 of the crew were killed, while 10 others were left clinging to wreckage. It took Kennedy nearly 3 hours swimming around in the dark to gather the survivors onto what was left of his PT boat. His engineer, Pappy McMahon, was badly burned, in excruciating pain and helpless. They were still stranded in open water at daybreak. In mid-afternoon, what was left of PT-109 was beginning to sink, and it looked like they'd been left for dead. After hours in the water, Kennedy led the survivors to Kossolo Island, and he saved the wounded McMahon by biting on the strap of his life jacket and towing him to safety. Exhausted, Kennedy had to be helped up the beach by the man that he actually towed. Reg Evans had witnessed the aftermath of the collision from his hideaway on Kolombangara Island. Evans, previously an accountant, had worked on a coconut plantation in Vanuatu and with a shipping company in the Solomon Islands. Now, a Coastwatcher's work was not to fight or destroy, it was to be eyes and the ears of the Pacific. In February 1943, Evans made his way to Kolombangara Island armed with radio equipment, a pair of binoculars and a Tommy gun. Working with locals, Evans set up and manned an observation post that afforded him a view of the island's airstrip and sea approaches to the town of Gizo. In June 1943, Evans came up with a plan to relocate to the small island of Gomu, which would provide a better view of activity in the Blackett Strait. He was planning to leave when he saw something in the water in the early hours of the 2nd of August 1943. He spotted 4 Japanese destroyers. One of them had put a searchlight on something floating in the water, and he thought he saw the wreckage of a boat and figures moving on it. In the darkness, it was too far away to see properly, but he sent a report to base immediately. Later that morning, headquarters contacted Evans. PT Boat 109 lost in action in Blackett Strait, crew of 12, request any information. Evans waited for word from the scouts reporting there were no survivors so far, but the 3 torpedoes had washed ashore in the coastal village of Vangavanga. There was nothing definite to report for days. He passed the news around, and there was nothing more that he could do. After travelling to his new observation post in Gomu, Evans found one of his scouts awaiting him with news that men on the island between Gizo and Ferguson Passage had found something. 2 men, Byuku Gaza and Aroni Kumara, had stumbled across the stranded Americans. Garza showing Kennedy how to scratch a few words into the husk of a green coconut would be the only way that he could communicate. The message read, Nauru Island Commander, native knows position. He can pilot, 11 alive, needs small boat, Kennedy. Back on Gomu, Evans checked his charts, wrote a message for the scout to deliver to the group, advising Kennedy to come to his position. After waiting for most of the day, Evans spotted the canoe returning late in the afternoon on the 7th of August. As the craft pulled in, the beaming faces of Byuku Garza and Aroni Kumana told him that our man was there. Lieutenant Kennedy pushed aside a blanket of coconut leaves and emerged from the bottom of the canoe. He didn't say much, not even about the destroyer. His whole concern was for his crew. He was shown the messages that had been sent and received and was told it wouldn't be hard to get him back by canoe to his PT base at Rendover. But he wouldn't hear of it. He said his place was with his men. What a true leader. Later, rescue boats met Kennedy and the survivors who were picked up to be returned to Rendover. The men who were with Kennedy that day all speak of his sense of responsibility, that it was his job, that he would spare no effort to try and get help for his crew. Evans wrote, how could I know that he would become President of the United States? But I'm glad he made it. He was a nice bloke. Evans was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his bravery and enterprise in reconnaissance operations. He was discharged from the Royal Australian Navy on the 17th of May 1946. When John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States, he kept the coconut on his desk in the Oval Office. Can you confirm? In an interview in 1961, he confirmed that Evans was his rescuer, saying that he had gone unthanked because he couldn't understand the handwriting. Evans' identity was confirmed in a congratulatory card he sent for the President at his inauguration, and the handwriting was matched. He was invited to the United States, where he met with PT boat veterans in New York, and then with President Kennedy at the White House. The following year, Evans returned to the islands and was reunited with the scouts who helped him during the war. Evans died aged 84 in 1989. We can indeed salute a true leader, somebody who gives us courage and somebody who we should take some note and live our lives in the same way. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. That's some tale. It's brilliant. I'd like to now invite Your Excellency, the Ambassador to Australia, Jacqueline Kennedy, to come up and say a few words. Oops, sorry, Caroline Kennedy.
Fine to be compared to her anytime. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to the Naval Association for inviting me to honor the Coastwatchers this morning. I know that these gatherings are more than just a ceremony. They're a chance to reflect on the values of our alliance, of the Navy, the values of freedom, preserving the stability of the rules-based order that has lifted millions into prosperity, and working daily to build a more just and peaceful world. That's what Americans and Australians have been doing together for more than 100 years. Our parents and grandparents, as we've heard, forged this alliance, and now it's our turn to carry it forward. Their shared sacrifice and service is an inspiration to all of us, and I'm so grateful to be here with so many people who have lived those values throughout their lives. I'm especially proud to be the United States Ambassador to Australia because America has no more important and trusted ally. And as you just heard personally, I wouldn't be here at all if it were not for Reg Evans, the Australian Coastwatcher, and the Solomon Scouts, who saved my father's life and that of his crew members in 1940 after the Japanese destroyer sunk his boat. A few days after I arrived here last year, just about a year ago, I went to the War Memorial where they showed me Reg Evans's diary, and I met the last two surviving Coastwatchers. And then I was able to travel to the Solomon Islands to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Guadalcanal, and also to thank the children of the Solomon Scouts who rescued my father. And I'm going to go back there next week for the 80th anniversary of his rescue, with my son. So I think for me it really shows that that our lives are shaped by the great events of our time and historical forces, but it's really the connections we make to one another that define us and shape our lives. There's also another part of the story which maybe people in Australia don't know, which is when I was ambassador to Japan, I had a chance to meet the widow of the Japanese destroyer captain that had sunk the boat, the PT boat. So she showed me one of her most treasured possessions. It turned out that my father had corresponded with the captain, who had also gone home and entered public service and become mayor of his town. But they corresponded throughout the 1950s, and he too was invited to the inauguration. He didn't come because they told him that no one would be nice to him. So, but his widow showed me a picture that my father had sent to him in a frame that was inscribed, "To Captain Hanami, late enemy, present friend." So I think that's the spirit of reconciliation. That has allowed Australia, the United States, and Japan to work so closely as allies committed to the same values, and that hopefully we will be able to achieve with others with whom we are not allies right now. But I think we are working to preserve the peace and prosperity in this region and around the world. We are joined in the effort to combat climate change, which is an existential crisis, and we are partnering to develop the new technologies which will transform the way we live. But we're doing it built on our shared history. This is really the alliance of the future. And in tribute to all those gathered here, I would like to close with a quote about the United States Navy from President Kennedy, and I know he would say the same about the Australian Navy. "I can think of no more rewarding career. Any man who may be asked in this century what he did to make his life worthwhile can respond with a good deal of pride and satisfaction, 'I served in the United States Navy.'" So thank you all for your service and for having me today. I do have something that I'd like to present to the Naval Association. If you hold on 1 second. It's a replica of the coconut shell that is in the Kennedy Library.
Well, that's wonderful and unique. Just very quickly, ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Kennedy was 3 years old when she and her family moved into 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue after her father was sworn in as the 35th President of the United States. The ambassador graduated from Harvard University and Columbia Law School. Most of her professional life has been in law, politics, education, reform and charitable work. I see she's laughing. Which of those are you laughing at? She also acted as a spokesperson for her family's legacy, particularly that of her father, and has co-authored 2 books with Ellen Alderman on civil liberties. The ambassador was at the forefront of education reform efforts in New York City, creating public-private partnerships to promote arts education, school libraries and performing arts spaces. The ambassador was appointed by President Obama as the United States Ambassador to Japan, a post in which she served from 2013 to 2017. She played a critical role in the commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, culminating in her historic visits of President Obama to Hiroshima and Prime Minister Abe to Pearl Harbor. She advanced realignment of the U.S. forces in Okinawa, promoted women's empowerment in Japan, and increased exchange. Honest mistake. In 2017, she founded the International Poetry Exchange Project to connect students virtually in Japan, Korea, Philippines, and the Bronx through the power of spoken words. In November 2021, she was awarded the Grand Cordon of the Order of the Rising Sun, the highest honour for which foreigners are eligible for her efforts to strengthen the United States-Japan alliance. The ambassador has published 11 New York Times best-selling books on law, civics and poetry. She is an honorary president of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation and serves as a trustee of numerous non-profit organisations, including the Carnegie Corporation. President Joe Biden appointed Caroline Kennedy as United States Ambassador to Australia, and on 25th of July 2022, Ambassador Kennedy presented her credentials to the Governor-Generals. What do you do in your spare time? Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause.